Mark Borthwick is an Open Oxford-Cambridge Doctoral Training Partnership Fellow at the Open University, exploring the implicit religions and cultural geographies of nature literatures, particularly how human cultures mutually co-create landscapes with our more than human conversation partners in the natural world. And he is presenting today on the Aeolian Epistolic, Geographic Imagination and Spiritual Experience in John Muir's Letters and Journals. Mark.
Thank you very much. Hello. So, much has been done in the social sciences to look at world-making stories, how ideas shape the world we are observing and continually co-creating in our human and more than human networks. In his handbook on literary eco-criticism, The Song of the Earth, Jonathan Bates says that the business of literature is to work upon consciousness. I'd like to explore with you today for 15 minutes one particular author who set out explicitly to work upon consciousness, John Muir, whose stories are literally world-making. And since the theme of this conference is letters and literatures, I want to delve into the complexity of Muir's writings and also look at the complications provided behind the scenes by reading of his letters. His writings, both published and unpublished, and his theories, both public and private, have gone on to define the landscape, establish global land management paradigms, and both honored and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. And I'll tell you how. John Muir was born in Dunbar, Scotland in 1838. He died in the United States in 1914, and that's where he lived most of his life. He was an essayist and a letter writer and an author of books. And these mostly describe his adventures in nature, especially in the Sierra Nevada of California, and they were read by millions. His activism helped to preserve the Yosemite Valley, form the Sequoia National Park, and his example has served as inspiration for the preservation of many other wilderness areas around the world. The Sierra Club, which he co-founded, is a prominent American conservation organization. And he did most of this through his works of literature. Through doing so, he is undoubtedly the founding father of the national parks model of conservation. It goes beyond this individual park, Yosemite, which is stood in here. His writing inspired thinking. Now, I'm sure you can recognize, can people see the slides moving? No. Okay. Slides have moved on. In my view, they have.
Mark, did you press take control?
I'm in control.
At the top. You're in control? Okay, great. Now you are.
Oh, I clicked sync slides to presenter and that fixed it, so.
Grand, thank you. Thanks, Mark.
So be noted. So anyway, this was the slide where I talked about John Muir's life, and this is the slide I was on. So I'm sure you recognize this fellow who stood with John Muir. John Muir has the big old beard, and the fellow next to him is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, at this time the sitting president of the United States, an outdoorsman and a huge fan of Muir, having been reading him for years, requested Muir meet him and take him on an outdoor excursion. They went to Yosemite. They went into the valley seen here with the 4,000-foot high walls, and they camped out underneath the giant sequoias. Upon returning from this trip, the president immediately instructed his Secretary of the Interior, Ethan Allen Hitchcock, to agree to Muir's request for the Yosemite Valley and Upper Mariposa Grove to be federally protected, and set out the founding work of the National Park Service. This is from the speech that he gave upon returning. Lying out at night under those giant trees was like lying in a temple built by no hand of man. They are monuments in themselves. So this is clear engagement with Muir's writing. His first publication was called God's First Temples. The notion that Yosemite was a temple crafted by the hands of God was frequently recurring as a motif in his work, as well as calling the Hetch Hetch Valley a temple far holier than any consecrated by humans. He mentions in one of his texts that no temple made with hands can compare with Yosemite, made with the hands of God. He also frequently refers to trees as monuments, including in the opening statements of Mountains of California, where he calls the granite walls of Yosemite monuments so noble and enduring. He refers to these as a monumental fir and a majestic monument to the king's forest, the king being God. Now, President Roosevelt, who here is showing, I think, deep engagement with Muir's work, went on to establish 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 53 wildlife sanctuaries, And eventually, when this Diaspora of Preservation coalesced into the National Park Service in 1916, the organization quoted him in their constitution. Similarly, Roosevelt wrote the obituary for John Muir and commended John Muir's ability to influence contemporary thought and action on the subjects to which he had devoted his life. So Muir's writing is deeply interpenetrative with the National Park Service and that which is called the Yellowstone model of conservation, which has been rolled out around the world. So what can we learn about this? What can we learn from looking at Muir's work about this conservation ethic? So the curious thing about Muir's writing is that it tends to take the form of an epistolary novel. And scholars such as yourselves will know that that is a novel that's letters or like a diary. So if you look at this printing on the left, it shows that these texts are written in, June 22nd I did this, June 23rd I experienced that. It's all very sensory, it's all very imminent. So you would assume that it's something that's happening to him at the time. However, Muir's writing career revealed several stages, the majority of which has a very prolonged gap in between the time that is observed, which ostensibly was collated in journals, although those journals are not in print, have not survived, and then were published much later on. You can see the gap. He was originally publishing quite quickly, and then he stopped to raise his children for a decade. And then he started writing books that were from 20 years previous. And in the third stage of his career, it is 40 and 60 years previous that he's writing about. So there are two trends here. The first is that towards the end of his life, he's reaching further back chronologically. And the second is that he shifted from articles towards books. However, biographies as recent as Wilkinson Stanley, 1995, presume that these texts are authentic records of Muir's activities and they're his genuine journals. But an analysis of Muir's letters reveal that we can doubt that narrative. And there's other evidences. Muir frequently returns to botanical terminology he was only educated in later in life. He was not carrying any botanical identification books into his foray in the sea area, famously carrying only a tin cup and a copy of Emerson, if we believe him. Stickeen, a short story which tells of Muir's personal relationship with a courageous titular animal, a small dog, was told orally for 30 years before ever being committed to paper. While professedly a true biographical story, and perhaps with genuine autobiographical elements, the dog has a fantastic level of intelligence and a neat narrative transformation. Earlier versions of this oral story, it's reported, had a female protagonist and the dog could talk. The published text, as it exists, is clearly an allegory first and a work of history second. Muir also delivers a very full account of glacier theory out of nowhere, despite having shown no engagement with the topic so far in his journals to date, in the chronology of the publication. The character of Muir in the novelizations is ignorant when Muir wants the audience to be discovering, and knowledgeable when Muir wants the audience to be taught. His meeting with Roosevelt, illustrated by that vertical line, shows he was well into this pattern by the time he met the president and was influencing policy on a very high level. So when we read Muir's texts, we are not witnessing things that are immediate. Instead, we are witnessing a self-conscious, philosophically rich text that is the result of his later development. And this matters because his works are so theory-laden. Muir's letters, which are his personal missives written to other people that don't go through the editor and aren't being published for whatever his wider consumption would be, provide a different level of verisimilitude or a different level of closeness to the thinking of the man who's in that later timeline when he's publishing these works. One of Muir's favorite self-representations, and one of the most famous passages in his collected works, detail him being tipped by a shifting of snow and surfing for several thousand feet on his back by an avalanche, published in our national parks in 1901. Now this passage has the rare distinction of an independent timestamp provided by a letter. An account of it was received by Samuel Neeland in 1872, so 30 years before, when Muir sent him a letter detailing the event. Indeed, this description can be found several times elsewhere in Muir's letters, each time becoming more fantastical. Additionally, by comparing Muir's notebooks to his letters to Jeannie Carr, we can see where Muir has taken reports and divided them into two separate incidents, or taken separate incidents and reporting them with concurrence. Presumably this was done to maximize their impact, including their literary impact, and increase the potential they would have to ferment in the reader an ecological conversion. There's plenty of evidence from Muir's private letters that he was a religious true believer. including like that 10 years he spent attending church, and his own personal, professions of faith and prayers for loved ones. And while we cannot state with certainty that Muir or any historical figure feels a true faith in a religious life, it does at least demonstrate that when Muir uses religious language in his writing, and he often does, to foment a certain kind of conversion in the reader, it is more than just a veneer to illustrate and illuminate his transcendentalist theories. Muir describes Yosemite as the very best of Eden fruit, which risks going to waste by being developed. And he uses the language of religious conversion. How glorious a conversion it is, so complete and wholesome it is. Scarce memory enough of old bondage days left as a standpoint to view it from. In this newness of life, we seem to have been so always. So in some ways, Muir is using this language to take the reader on a journey with familiar symbols to help them become an ecological convert in the style of a religious convert. In other ways, Muir is a very deeply religious individual, and this language doesn't go far enough to illustrate the extent to which his faith is there. Muir quotes extensively from Paradise Lost in a way that would have been familiar, ubiquitously familiar, is one of the most famous books of the time to a certain kind of reader, but also renders this religious language invisible to other readers and to contemporary readers now who are less familiar with that text. And you might be wondering, Mark, why does the religious quality or any of this like submerged thinking in this thinker matter? Look at that beautiful valley. He's right. It is an Eden. But, of course it matters because Eden is an unspoiled wilderness protected from sinful humans. And in fact, this isn't an unspoiled wilderness. There are people living here. Pictured here are the Awanichi and Miwok Native Americans. In truth, Muir had not seen Eden. He hadn't seen a landscape unmarked by humankind. These people had lived here for 10,000 years before the first white sighting in California. Estimates say that there was around 20,000 members of these tribes living there at the time. Although, who knows, that's a European estimate. Muir has a certain amount of contempt for these Native Americans. In his book, he describes them as a strangely dirty and irregular, dark-eyed, dark-haired, half-happy savages living in this nice, clean wilderness. Dirty savages in this clean wilderness. He did trade with them, but he describes him as gifting and them as begging in return. So we see here a racism classic of his time. And these people were broadly cleared out of the park, and their traditional freedoms were interrupted in order to do the kind of preservation that Muir and Roosevelt were imagining, including controlled burning, irrigation, pruning, selective harvesting, all these things that made their foodways possible. Now, the Europeans didn't like the burning. They thought it might endanger the redwoods. But over time, the lack of controlled burning led to uncontrolled wildfires as that biomaterial accumulated in the understory. So the indigenous people knew a thing or two. And eventually they've been brought back in and encouraged and asked to manage the land again. But again, why does this matter? This is a black and white photo. Surely it's in the distant past. In 1951, this Yellowstone model of conservation was exported over to Africa. They formed the Serengeti National Park to protect certain charismatic megafauna. And the Masai Mara people were removed from the land. And a similar pattern has transpired here, where they were forcibly removed, and eventually they've been invited back because it was recognised the ecosystem services were essential. Understanding Muir's ideology here is important because his ideology is manifesting over and over around the world in these conservation structures. My own hometown in the Lake District in England was also formed in 1951, the same year as Serengeti was formed. And here we see a house, not my house, I wish. And you can see these white specks in this distant picture are the roofs of Windermere. So the white folk weren't asked to leave, and they weren't forcibly removed. And again, if we look at Muir and we understand him as being, as protecting pristine landscape from dirty people, why are some people allowed to remain? And since these are the conservation structures that we're living within and the dominant conservation paradigm that we're within, better understanding the people who made it and the writings that have informed it and the structures that continue to be implemented seems of critical importance. So my clock says 15 minutes. So I will bring us to a conclusion. 15 minutes isn't a very long time, but I hope I've whetted your appetite for these debates. If you're interested in corresponding about this, my email's on the screen. So I'll conclude with a quote from Donna Haraway. She says that stories, 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 knots, knots, not, knots, not, knots. These letters and literatures matter. And I'm interested in how our academic skill set can hone theory and shape policy, including this kind of analysis. So if you take one thing away from this talk, let it be this. Our literary visions of conservation, which are conspicuously fictional and suspiciously religious, are theory-laden, and they are playing out all around us in the world today. If we want to challenge, manipulate, and interrogate these ideas and the structures that carry these ideas, we can look meaningfully to the foundational, inspirational stories from which they came. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I know that there's going to be a response to that and people will have questions. We're going to ask people to put questions in the Q&A for now, and we'll hold them until all of our speakers have spoken. Thanks so much.